The alien queen married her barren daughter to a human and froze when she saw her grandchildren years later. The throne room of Alindra had been constructed from a material that didn't technically exist in three-dimensional space, which made cleaning it an absolute nightmare. This was the thought occupying Chancellor Thevris as he waited for Queen Veilora to acknowledge his presence. He'd been standing there for approximately 17 minutes by human reckoning, though the Alindran timekeeping system measured it as roughly half a contemplation cycle. The queen was doing that thing again, staring at the genealogical projection hovering before her throne, a cascading hologram of family lines that stretched back 6,000 years, each connection pulsing with soft blue light like veins carrying the blood of stars. Thevris cleared his throat, which produced a sound not unlike a crystal glass being struck at precisely the right frequency. Veelora's ears, those magnificent sweeping extensions that could detect heartbeats from across a room, twitched slightly. Progress. The physicians have confirmed it, he said, deciding to simply begin. Princess Solari's cellular structure is incompatible with standard reproductive protocols. The probability of natural conception is calculated at 0.0003%, with a margin of error that makes even that number generous. The queen's fingers moved through the hologram, causing entire branches of the family tree to light up and fade. Her skin, which normally held the pale luminescence of moonlight on water, had gone dull. 0.0003%, she repeated. So you're telling me there's a chance? Thevris blinked. Had the queen just made a joke? In his 4 centuries of service, he'd heard her laugh perhaps twice, and both times it had been at funerals. He decided to treat the comment as rhetorical. The issue lies in the quantum binding of her reproductive cells, he continued, pulling up his own datapad, which immediately synced with the room systems and projected a dizzying array of biological schematics. See here, the cellular resonance is 0.47 degrees out of phase with standard Alindran frequencies. It's not that she's infertile in the traditional sense. It's that her body exists at slightly the wrong angle to reality for conception to occur. How wonderfully poetic, Veilora murmured. My daughter is geometrically incompatible with motherhood. Essentially, yes. The silence that followed was the kind that made junior courtiers faint. Thevris had developed an immunity over the years, though he still felt the weight of it pressing against his chest. The queen rose from her throne, an unnecessary gesture, since she could have simply commanded the room to bring everything to her level, and walked to the great curved window that overlooked the city. Alindra spread below them in impossible spirals of architecture, buildings that seemed to grow from mathematical principles rather than engineering, connected by bridges of light that recalculated their paths based on traffic patterns predicted 17 seconds into the future. I met a human once, Veilora said suddenly. This was even more surprising than the earlier possible joke. Thevris's ears stood fully upright. Your Majesty? At the Interspecies Biological Symposium on Kepler 442b. Dreadfully boring affair, everyone presenting papers on genetic compatibility and biological divergence. But there was this human, arguing quite passionately that incompatibility was merely a failure of imagination. She turned, and something in her expression made Thevris take an involuntary step backward. He said that Earth's history was full of supposedly impossible biological pairings that produced offspring. That life, as he put it, finds a way when you're not looking too hard. Your Majesty, surely you're not suggesting. Get me the files from that symposium. I want to know which humans attended, specifically those specializing in extremophile biology and cross-species reproduction. Thevris felt his secondary stomach clench, the one Alindrans used for processing stress hormones. The Council will consider this highly irregular. The Council, Veilora said, her voice taking on the harmonics that made it impossible to disobey, can calculate the probability of me caring about their opinions. I believe they'll find it's roughly 0.0003%. She smiled then, sharp and bright, with a generous margin of error. As Thevris bowed and retreated, already composing messages he knew would cause half the court to experience synchronous cardiac palpitations, he couldn't help but wonder if the Queen had finally miscalculated. Alindrans had conquered faster-than-light travel, had mapped the quantum foam of reality itself, had built cities that existed in 6 dimensions simultaneously. But they'd never tried to marry a princess to a human before. The holographic family tree continued to pulse behind the empty throne, its branches reaching into the past with absolute certainty and into the future with nothing but hope and stubbornness and the kind of desperation that makes even queens believe in 0.0003% chances. Aaron was explaining to a bacterium why it shouldn't exist when the Elindrans arrived. You see, he muttered to the sample under his microscope, according to every established principle of biochemistry, you should have dissolved into your component molecules about 4 billion years ago. Yet here you are, living in water that's cold enough to shatter steel, eating sulfur, and apparently having a great time doing it. He made a note on his datapad. I think you're showing off. The research station orbiting Europa had exactly 7 permanent residents, and Aaron suspected he was the only one who talked to his work. Dr. Yuki Chan insisted her plant samples didn't count because they were technically multicellular, which meant the conversations were more sophisticated. Aaron had pointed out that sophistication was relative when you were arguing with a fern about photosynthesis rates, but Yuki had just laughed and told him his bacteria were judging him. She wasn't wrong. The alert chimed with a frequency that made Aaron look up. That particular tone meant something had entered Jupiter's orbital space without clearance, which happened approximately once every never. The station's AI, which everyone called Harold because it had gotten tired of being called System, spoke with its usual long-suffering tone. Aaron, we have visitors. They claim to be from the Elindran Consortium and say they're here on diplomatic business. I've checked their credentials and they appear legitimate, which is somehow more alarming than if they were fake. Elindran. Aaron sat back from his microscope. That's the civilization that built the quantum bridge network through Sector 7, right? The ones whose ships are supposed to be impossible. The very same. Also, they're asking for you specifically, which should concern you more than it apparently does. Aaron stood and moved to the observation window. The Elindran ship hung in space like a piece of jewelry someone had dreamed into existence. It didn't have the clunky engineering of human vessels, all thrust vectors and heat dissipation panels. Instead, it seemed to suggest the idea of a ship, a form that light bent around in ways that made his eyes water if he looked too long. Why would they want me? According to their message, they're seeking one who understands the poetry of incompatible life. I assume that's either a translation error or they've been reading your published papers, which is functionally the same thing given your writing style. My writing style is perfectly clear. You once described extremophile adaptation as nature's way of making philosophers out of molecules. The peer reviewers had questions. 3 hours later, Aaron found himself in the station's cramped docking bay, watching 3 Elindrans step through the airlock with a grace that suggested they found gravity optional. They were tall, easily 7 feet, and their skin held a luminescence that seemed to come from somewhere slightly to the left of reality. But it was their ears that caught his attention, sweeping back from their heads in elegant curves that picked up every sound in the room, twitching and adjusting with obvious intelligence. The lead emissary spoke through a translation device that hummed like a disappointed tuning fork. Aaron Saleth, your work on cross-environmental biological adaptation has been noted by the Elindran Consortium. We have a proposition that requires someone with your unique perspective. My perspective is mostly bacteria-focused, Aaron said. I'm not sure how helpful I'll be with galactic politics. We're not interested in politics. The emissary's skin flickered through several colors that the translator apparently couldn't interpret. We need you to solve an impossible problem. Are you familiar with the concept of quantum biological incompatibility? I've read about it. When 2 organisms exist at slightly different frequencies on the quantum level, making reproduction impossible despite apparent physical compatibility. Precisely. The emissary leaned forward. How would you solve such a problem? Aaron thought about his bacteria, thriving in conditions that should kill them, eating poison and calling it dinner. I wouldn't solve it, he said slowly. I'd change the conditions until it solved itself. Life doesn't overcome impossible barriers. It finds angles where the barriers don't quite exist. The 3 Elindrans exchanged glances, their ears performing a complicated dance of communication. Would you be willing to travel to Elindra? All expenses covered, of course. The compensation would be substantial. How substantial? Enough to fund your research for several lifetimes. Yours, specifically. We understand human lifespans are, the translator made a sound like an apology, brief. Yuki told him he was insane. Harold offered to update his will. But 3 days later, Aaron found himself aboard the impossible ship, watching Europa shrink behind him, heading toward a civilization that had somehow decided he was the answer to a question they hadn't quite asked. The bacterium he'd left under the microscope would have approved. After all, it had built an entire existence on doing the impossible. Aaron just wished he'd thought to ask what, exactly, they expected him to do before he'd left everything he knew behind. But then again, he'd never been particularly good at asking the right questions until he was already neck-deep in the wrong answers. The ship bent space, and Europa vanished into a memory. The wedding planner was having what humans would call a nervous breakdown, except Alindrans experienced stress as a visible spectrum shift across their skin. Currently, Coordinator Cell this was cycling through colors that didn't have names in any Earth language, settling somewhere between ultraviolet anxiety and infrared panic. "He can't wear that," Cell said, gesturing at Aaron's formal suit with obvious horror. "The fabric is absorbing light instead of refracting it. He'll look like a void in space. A mobile absence of meaning." "It's a tuxedo," Aaron said patiently. "On Earth, this is what we wear to weddings. On Earth, you also consume fermented plant matter for recreation and consider it sophisticated. Forgive me if I don't defer to human aesthetic judgment." Aaron had been on Alindra for 6 weeks, and he'd learned that Alindrans had mastered faster-than-light travel, quantum computing, and biological immortality, but sarcasm had somehow remained universal. He'd also learned that he was supposed to marry Princess Cellari in what amounted to a very expensive science experiment, though nobody had quite phrased it that way to his face. They'd met 4 times. Twice officially, with Chancellor Thevris hovering nearby like a nervous moon. Twice unofficially, when Cellari had simply appeared in the garden where Aaron spent his evenings trying to understand plants that grew according to mathematical principles he'd need another degree to comprehend. "You talk to them," she'd said during their second unofficial meeting, her ears tilted forward with curiosity. "The plants. I've been watching. You narrate your thoughts as if they're listening." Aaron had felt his face warm. "It's a habit. Helps me think through problems. We have a saying, those who speak to unhearing things are either mad or lonely." Her skin had flickered with something that might have been amusement. "Sometimes both. Which do you think I am?" "I think you're very far from home, talking to plants because they don't look at you like you're a solution to a problem." She'd paused. "I understand the feeling." Now, standing in a preparation chamber that existed in more dimensions than he could perceive, wearing ceremonial crystals that hummed against his chest, Aaron wondered if 2 lonely people making a political arrangement counted as romance or tragedy. Probably both, knowing his luck. The ceremony took place in the Hall of Perpetual Harmonies, which was exactly as pretentious as it sounded. Aaron stood on a platform that adjusted his height so he could look Cellari more or less in the eye, though she still had 6 inches on him even with the assistance. She wore something that might have been fabric or might have been crystallized light, he genuinely couldn't tell, and her ears were adorned with silver threads that chimed softly when she moved. She was terrifying and beautiful and looked as uncomfortable as he felt. The officiant spoke in resonant harmonics that the translator in Aaron's ear rendered as, "We gather to witness the joining of quantum-compatible biological entities in the hope of producing viable offspring, thereby continuing the unbroken chain of." "Could we maybe skip to the part with less clinical terminology?" Aaron whispered. Cellari's ears twitched. Was that suppressed laughter? The officiant looked scandalized, cycling through at least 4 colors of bureaucratic outrage, but continued with a slightly abbreviated version. Aaron was supposed to offer Cellari a crystalline sphere containing samples of his genetic material, which was exactly as romantic as it sounded, while she presented him with a harmonic frequency attuned to his neural patterns. He'd practiced this part. He'd practiced it 17 times. He still almost dropped the sphere. Cellari caught it with reflexes that shouldn't have been possible, her hand closing around both the crystal and his fingers. "Steady," she murmured, too quiet for the translator to catch, but he understood the tone. When it came time for her to present the harmonic frequency, she was supposed to project it through specialized equipment. Instead, she simply hummed it, a sound that resonated in his chest and made his teeth ache in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. The officiant looked ready to file a complaint with someone, probably everyone. The reception was worse. Elindran nobility clustered in groups, their conversations happening at frequencies Aaron could only partially hear, but he caught enough. The human experiment. The Queen's desperation. How charmingly primitive. One particularly bold courtier approached and asked, with apparent sincerity, whether humans could perceive more than 3 colors or if that was a myth. "We see millions of colors," Aaron said evenly. "We just don't broadcast our emotional state across our skin, so we've learned to read faces instead. For instance, right now I can tell you're being condescending because your smile doesn't reach your eyes, and you're standing at an angle that suggests you're already planning your exit from this conversation." The courtier's skin flickered through several shades of embarrassed purple before they excused themselves. "That was satisfying to watch," Cellari said, appearing beside him with 2 drinks that smelled like starlight and poor decisions. "Do I want to know what this is?" "Probably not. But it will make the next 3 hours more tolerable." She raised her glass. "To impossible solutions and the people desperate enough to attempt them." Aaron clinked his glass against hers, and it shattered immediately in her grip, sending luminescent liquid cascading down her ceremonial attire. The entire hall went silent. Cellari stared at the broken glass, at her hand, at Aaron's mortified expression. Then she laughed, a sound like wind chimes falling downstairs, absolutely undignified and completely genuine. "I think," she said, still laughing as attendants rushed forward with cloths and concern, "this marriage might actually be interesting." 3 years had passed, which was either a very long time or barely a moment, depending on who was counting. Aaron counted in human years because it was all he knew. Cellari counted in something she called resonance cycles, which seemed to involve planetary alignments and quantum states and gave Aaron a headache when she tried to explain it. They'd left Alindra after the first year, when it became clear that pregnancy wasn't happening and the court's disappointment had solidified into something between pity and disdain. Queen Vealora had stopped sending messages after month 14. Aaron suspected it hurt Cellari more than she admitted, but Alindrans weren't particularly forthcoming about emotional pain, preferring to broadcast it across their skin in colors only other Alindrans could properly interpret. The research outpost on Thurin 4 was a compromise between worlds, a moon that orbited a gas giant, staffed by a dozen species who'd all decided that the frontier was more interesting than their respective homeworlds. The head physician was a Keltorian named Zix who had 3 eyes and the bedside manner of a particularly annoyed rock. "You need to stop bringing me broken equipment," Zix said, examining the spectrometer Aaron had dropped for the 3rd time that month. "I'm a doctor, not an engineer. You fixed it the last 2 times. Because I was bored. Now I'm irritated, which is different." Zix's middle eye focused on Aaron with uncomfortable intensity. "You look tired. When did you last sleep properly?" "I sleep fine." "That's not what I asked." Aaron had learned that arguing with Zix was like arguing with entropy, technically possible but ultimately futile. "Cellari's been having nightmares. She doesn't wake me on purpose, but her bioluminescence gets brighter when she's distressed. It's like trying to sleep next to a distressed lighthouse." "Have you considered talking to her about it?" We talk. We talk about everything." Which was true. They developed their own language over 3 years, a hybrid of human directness and Alindran contextual harmonics. Cellari had learned to appreciate human cinema, particularly disaster films, which he found hilarious. "Your species documents theoretical catastrophes for entertainment," she'd said while watching a movie about asteroids. "It's like you're practicing being afraid." Aaron had learned to read the subtle shifts in her ear positions, could distinguish between 14 different types of contentment based on the angle of her head. But they didn't talk about the failure. About the reason they'd been brought together in the first place. "Talking about everything except the important thing isn't the same as communication," Zix said, handing back the spectrometer. "Also, this is still broken. I just made it look fixed." "You're welcome." That evening, Aaron found Cellari in the garden she'd cultivated, a small plot where earth plants and Alindran flora had learned to coexist through sheer stubborn proximity. She was kneeling beside a tomato plant, her fingers hovering over its leaves without quite touching. "It's going to produce fruit," she said without looking up. "I've been monitoring its quantum state. The probability matrix just collapsed into certainty." "That's great. We'll have actual tomatoes." He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Zix says I need to talk to you about the nightmares. Her ears flattened slightly. Zix should mind his own medical business. He also said the spectrometer is still broken and I should stop trusting him with my equipment. That got a flicker of amusement across her skin. What about the nightmares? You tell me. You're the one having them. Cellari was quiet for a long moment, her hand finally settling on the tomato plant stem. I dream that I'm back in the palace. Everyone is watching me, waiting. And I'm empty. Not barren. Emptiness and inability aren't the same thing. But I'm hollow, like a crystal with nothing inside to refract the light. She paused. Then I wake up here, and you're beside me, and I remember that I chose this. This small moon, this garden, you. And I don't know if that makes it better or worse. Well, that's appropriately devastating. Aaron reached over and took her hand, which was still larger than his, still occasionally forgot its own strength. For what it's worth, I don't think you're empty. I think you're someone who was told her only value was something she couldn't provide, and you believed it because everyone else did. Is this the part where you provide inspiring human wisdom? No, this is the part where I remind you that we've built something here that has nothing to do with anyone's expectations. You've turned xenobotany into an art form. I've published 4 papers that are actually being read by people who aren't legally obligated to. We adopted a creature that exists in 2 time streams simultaneously and named it Schrödinger, which is objectively hilarious. Solari's ears lifted slightly. You're right. That is objectively hilarious. We're not a failure just because we're not what they wanted us to be. She turned to look at him fully, her eyes reflecting the light of Thurin IV's distant sun. When did you become so certain? About 3 years ago, when someone laughed after shattering a glass at her own wedding. He squeezed her hand. That's when I realized we might actually understand each other. 2 weeks later, Cellari collapsed during breakfast. Zix ran every test in his considerably varied arsenal, muttering in 3 languages about impossible readings and equipment malfunction. When he finally emerged from the medical bay, his middle eye was fixed on some point in the distance that might have been infinity. She's pregnant, he said flatly. Twins. And before you ask how this is possible when it's supposedly impossible, let me save us both time. I have absolutely no idea. Biology is apparently taking suggestions now. Aaron sat down heavily on the nearest surface, which happened to be a medical cart that rolled away beneath him. He caught himself before falling, which seemed metaphorically appropriate for his entire life lately. You're sure? I'm sure that something is happening that shouldn't be happening, which in medical terms means yes, I'm sure. Zix's third eye finally focused on Aaron. Congratulations. You've achieved quantum biological compatibility through what I can only describe as sheer narrative convenience. Aaron started laughing. He couldn't help it. 3 years of trying, of not trying, of living their lives while the weight of expectations slowly lifted, and now. Does she know? He asked when he could breathe again. She knows something's wrong. I haven't told her what yet. Thought you might want to be there for that conversation. Cellari was sitting up when Aaron entered, her skin cycling through colors he'd learned meant confusion and concern. When she saw him, saw whatever expression he was wearing, her ears lifted. Well, she said slowly, either something wonderful or terrible has happened. Both, Aaron said. Probably both. Definitely both. The pregnancy was, in Zix's professional opinion, aggressively improbable and personally offensive to established medical science. He said this at least once a day, usually while running yet another scan that showed results he didn't believe. Look at this, he'd mutter, gesturing at holographic displays that meant nothing to Aaron but apparently everything to Zix. The cellular resonance is shifting between quantum states. They're existing in superposition until observed, at which point they collapse into. He'd trail off, all 3 eyes unfocused. This shouldn't work. And yet, Cellari would say from the medical bed, her hand resting on her abdomen where the impossible was busy happening. And yet, Zix would agree, sounding betrayed by the universe itself. The first trimester was a catalogue of bizarre symptoms that seemed to borrow from both human and Elendran pregnancy with creative enthusiasm. Cellari experienced morning sickness that only occurred at night, developed a craving for foods from both their worlds simultaneously. She wanted ice cream and crystallized light supplements in the same bowl, and her bioluminescence became unpredictable, flickering in patterns that Aaron swore were prime numbers. "I think the twins are doing math," he said one evening, watching the light pulse across her skin. "Don't be ridiculous." Her ears twitched. "Though you're right, that was the Fibonacci sequence. Our children are already showing off. I'm so proud." The second trimester brought complications that made Zix's general air of pessimism seem optimistic by comparison. Cellari's body was struggling with changes it had been told were impossible, her cellular structure trying to accommodate growth it had no template for. She spent 3 weeks on enforced bed rest, which made her irritable in ways that manifested as small electromagnetic pulses that kept shorting out the medical equipment. "You're doing this on purpose," Zix accused after the 4th monitor failure. "If I could control my electromagnetic field, do you think I'd be lying here watching the ceiling?" Cellari snapped back. "Fair point. Stop it anyway." Aaron spent those weeks reading to her from human literature, which she claimed to find soothing. He suspected she just enjoyed critiquing the scientific inaccuracies. "Humans breathe in space in this story," she noted during a particularly dramatic chapter. "It's fantasy. We're allowed some creative license." "You're allowed to be wrong entertainingly, you mean?" says the woman whose people built cities in 6 dimensions because 3 was apparently too limiting. 4 dimensions. 6 would be showing off. She paused. "We're saving that for the next millennium." The births happened on a Tuesday, which Aaron only knew because he'd been maintaining a human calendar out of sheer stubbornness. Zix had wanted to perform a controlled surgical extraction, but the twins had their own timeline. Cellari's water broke during breakfast, and suddenly the carefully planned medical protocols dissolved into organized chaos. "This is happening too fast," Zix said, which Aaron had learned was doctor speak for, "I'm terrified but professionally obligated to appear calm." "Tell them that," Cellari gasped, her skin flashing through colors that Aaron didn't need to speak Elendran to interpret as pain. The labor lasted 7 hours, which Zix later told him was remarkably fast for a first-time hybrid birth. Not that we have any baseline for comparison because this has literally never happened before. Aaron held Cellari's hand and tried not to think about all the things that could go wrong, which was impossible, so instead he narrated the dumbest human jokes he could remember. "Why did the photon bring luggage to the airport?" "I swear if this is going where I think it's going," Cellari's words cut off in a sharp breath. "Because it was traveling light. I'm divorcing you. As soon as this is over, I'm filing the paperwork." You laughed. "I saw your ears. That was a muscle spasm." The girl came first, small and squalling and impossibly real. Zix caught her with hands that were steadier than Aaron expected, clearing her airway while running a scanner over her with his third eye. "Viable," he said, and the relief in his voice was profound. "Respiratory function normal. Cardiac rhythm strong. She's perfect." 6 minutes later, her brother followed, quieter but equally determined. Zix performed the same practiced dance of medical assessment and wonder. "Also viable. Also perfect. I'm going to need to revise several textbooks." They placed both twins on Cellari's chest, and Aaron watched 3 years of doubt and disappointment evaporate in the face of their small, strange, impossible children. The girl had her mother's ears, though smaller, softer. The boy had Aaron's nose but eyes that held colors he'd never seen in a human face. Their skin didn't quite glow like Cellari's, but it held a warmth that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than simple biology. "They're beautiful," Cellari whispered, her exhaustion evident in the dimming of her bioluminescence. "They're terrifying," Aaron said honestly. "What do we do with them?" "The standard protocol is feeding, cleaning, and preventing them from dying for the next 18 years. "I was asking philosophically. Then philosophically, we figure it out as we go." She looked up at him, her ears drooping with fatigue but her expression determined. "But first, we have to go back." Aaron had known this was coming. Had been avoiding thinking about it for months. Elendra. She should know. Whatever else happened, whatever disappointment came before, Solari's hand moved over the twins, protective and gentle. My mother should know she has grandchildren. Zix, listening from across the room, made a sound that might have been agreement. I'm coming with you. Someone needs to document this for medical journals, and I want my name on every paper. I'm thinking the Thurin 4 miracle. How two species achieve compatibility through sheer stubbornness. That's a terrible title, Aaron said. It's an accurate title, which is better. 2 weeks later, when Solari had recovered enough to travel and the twins had demonstrated they could survive outside controlled medical conditions, they prepared to leave. The ship was smaller than the one that had brought Aaron to Alindra years ago, but it would do. What do we even say? Aaron asked the night before departure, watching the twins sleep in their shared cradle. They'd started synchronizing their breathing patterns, which Zix claimed was either adorable or medically concerning, possibly both. We say nothing. Solari came to stand beside him, her hand finding his. We let them speak for themselves. The ship descended through Alindra's atmosphere with what Aaron had come to recognize as Alindran efficiency. Silent, elegant, and making human engineering look like enthusiastic cave painting by comparison. The twins were awake, pressing their faces against the observation ports with the kind of fearless curiosity that came from not yet understanding that most of the universe was terrifying. Why is everything shiny? The girl asked. They'd named her Lisa, which worked in both languages and meant something about light, though Aaron could never remember if it was the having of light or the absence of it. Because your grandmother's people believe that beauty should be mathematically provable, Solari said, adjusting her formal attire with hands that trembled slightly. Aaron caught the movement, reached over and stilled her fingers with his own. She's either going to accept them or she won't, he said quietly. But they exist regardless. We're not here for permission. Then why are we here? Because you wanted her to know. And because somewhere under all that royal calculation, she's still your mother. Zix, who'd insisted on accompanying them while complaining about it constantly, made a noise from his seat. Also because this is historically significant, and I'm getting at least 3 papers out of it. Possibly 4 if anyone tries to claim the births were a hoax. Your dedication to science is truly inspiring, Aaron said. I prefer obsessive, but I'll accept inspiring. The landing platform was empty except for Chancellor Thevris, who looked like he'd aged several decades despite Alindran's barely aging at all. His skin had lost some of its luminescence, and his ears drooped at angles that suggested he'd been dealing with bureaucratic stress for far too long. Princess Solari, he said, his voice carrying harmonics of genuine relief. We received your message. Her Majesty is waiting in the private receiving room, not the throne hall. She specified that this should be, he paused, searching for words, personal. They walked through corridors Aaron remembered from years ago, though they seemed smaller now, less overwhelming. Or perhaps he'd just gotten used to being overwhelmed. The twins walked between them, holding their parents' hands, their ears, smaller and softer than full Alindran but distinctly pointed, twitching at every new sound. Are there other children here? Lisa asked. Not many, Solari said. Alindran children are rare. Precious. Are we precious? Devastatingly so, Aaron said. Also exhausting. Mostly exhausting. The boy, Tevin, had been quiet for most of the journey, but now he looked up at his mother. Is your mother scary? Terrifying, Solari admitted. But I think she might be more frightened than we are. The private receiving room was smaller than Aaron expected, though still larger than most human houses. Queen Vealora stood by the window, her back to them, her posture rigid enough to suggest she'd been standing there for some time. When she turned, Aaron saw what 3 years of silence had cost her, not in aging, but in the dimming of something essential. She looked like someone who'd calculated every possibility except the one that mattered. Her eyes moved across them. Solari, whom she hadn't seen in 3 years. Aaron, the human experiment who'd disappeared into the frontier. Zix, who was busy recording everything on multiple devices and pretending not to be emotionally invested. And then the twins, standing hand in hand, looking back at her with expressions that mixed curiosity with the careful assessment children use when meeting important adults they're not sure about. The silence stretched. Aaron counted to 10, then 20. Solari's hand tightened in his. Thevris looked like he might dissolve from tension. Then Veilora moved. Not with her usual measured grace, but suddenly, as if something had broken in her very careful control. She crossed the room and simply stopped, standing before the children, her height making her tower over them in a way that should have been intimidating but somehow wasn't. "You have your mother's ears," she said to Tevin, her voice catching on something that might have been wonder or grief or both. "And yours," Tevin said, because 4-year-olds had no concept of diplomatic restraint. Veelora's skin flickered through a dozen colors in rapid succession. Surprise, joy, sorrow, colors Aaron still couldn't name. "Yes," she whispered. "And mine." Lisa, never one to be left out, stepped forward. "Are you really a queen? Father said you rule an entire star system, but Mother said that's oversimplifying." "It is oversimplifying," Veilora said. "But yes, I'm really a queen." She knelt then, actually lowered herself to their level, and the informality of the gesture made Thevris make a small sound of shock. "What are your names?" They told her, stumbling over the pronunciation in that way children do, correcting each other and arguing about whose name was harder to say. Veilora listened with an attention that suggested she was memorizing every syllable, every inflection. "May I?" She stopped, looked up at Solari. "May I touch them?" Solari nodded, unable to speak. Veilora reached out to Tevin, her hand hovering near his ear, the distinctive pointed shape that marked him as partly hers, partly human, entirely himself. He didn't flinch, just watched her with solemn eyes. When her fingers finally made contact, tracing the curve of his ear with a gentleness Aaron hadn't known she possessed, something in her expression cracked completely. Tears tracked down her face, glowing with bioluminescence, leaving trails of light on her skin. "I thought," her voice broke. "I calculated every probability, prepared for every outcome. But I never—" "You never thought we'd actually succeed," Solari finished quietly. "No." Veelora's other hand reached for Lisa, who took it without hesitation, tiny fingers wrapping around one elegant Elindran digit. "I thought I was sending you away to fail slowly, where I wouldn't have to watch. I thought I was losing you both to an impossible dream." "You were," Aaron said, "because someone needed to say it. You did lose us. We built a life where we weren't trying to solve your problem. We were just trying to live." Veilora looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw the queen dissolve into something smaller and more human than he'd thought possible. "I was so certain I knew what would happen. Certainty is a dangerous thing when you're wrong." "Grandmother," Lisa said, testing the word. Veilora closed her eyes, and more luminescent tears fell. "Yes. You're kneeling in the light stream. Mother says that's bad for the knees. Even Elindran knees." The laugh that escaped Veilora was broken and genuine and nothing like the measured sounds Aaron had heard from her before. She pulled both children close, carefully, as if afraid they might dissolve, and held them while her daughter watched with her own tears falling silent and bright. "I have missed so much," Veilora said into their hair. "Then stop missing it," Solari said, her voice steady despite everything. "We're here now." Later, after the twins had been given sweets and shown to a garden and were busy explaining Earth games to confused courtiers, Aaron found himself alone with Veilora on a balcony overlooking the city. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not giving up on her when I did. I didn't do it for you. I know. That's why it matters." She looked at him, this being who could calculate star systems but had somehow miscalculated her own daughter. "What you've built, what you are together, it wasn't what I planned." "No," Aaron agreed. "It's better." Veilora smiled, and for the first time, it reached her eyes. "Yes, it is. The end."